The morning Marcus Calloway fired me, he performed it. That is the only word for what he did. Not a private conversation, not a call from HR, not even the dignity of a written notice delivered to my inbox the night before. He waited until the full company Zoom was live, 200 faces tiled across the screen, and he leaned toward his camera like a man delivering news he had been rehearsing all week. "Daniel," he said, "effective immediately, you are no longer with the company." Then came the part he had been looking forward to. His voice dropped half a register, the way people do when they want to sound both reasonable and powerful at the same time. Legal has issued an 18-month non-compete. IP protection effective today. I want to thank Daniel for his past contributions. Past. One word. 8 years of my life folded into the past tense before 200 people who said nothing. I did not unmute. I did not react. I had learned that kind of stillness from my father, who spent 30 years as a union electrician and taught me early that the most dangerous thing you can do, in a room full of people watching you, is let them see the wound. My camera stayed on. My face stayed flat. And then, quietly, I clicked leave meeting and disappeared from the grid. The screen went gray. I sat in the silence of my home office for exactly 45 seconds. Then I stood up, walked to the kitchen, poured the rest of my coffee down the drain because it had gone cold, and went to the garage. In the back corner, behind an old network rack I had been meaning to decommission. For 2 years, there was a locked metal drawer. Inside it sat a small external drive with a strip of black tape across the face and 2 words written in marker, Cassian Core. I held it in my palm for a moment. It was lighter than it should have been, given what it contained. Then I put it in my jacket pocket, went back inside, and started making calls. Not to HR, not to a recruiter, not to anyone at the company. To my attorney. I need to go back a little, because none of what happened later makes sense without understanding what Marcus was actually afraid of. My name is Daniel Hargrove. I am 53 years old, and for 8 years I served as principal architect and head of platform engineering at a mid-size B2B analytics company called Viridian Systems. You may not have heard of them, most people have not, but if you have ever used a major retail inventory platform, a regional healthcare dashboard, or a logistics routing tool in the northeastern United States, there is a reasonable chance you were looking at infrastructure I designed. I was not the loudest person at Viridian. That was always Marcus. He had been brought in as CEO 4 years after I joined, recruited by the board at the recommendation of his uncle, who sat on the investment committee. Marcus was 38, photogenic, confident, and absolutely convinced that software companies were won by slides and relationships, not by the engineers building in the dark. He was not entirely wrong about the relationships part. He was dangerously wrong about the engineers. In the first year he ran the company, Marcus made 3 product decisions that nearly killed the platform. He pushed a feature release without letting QA finish their cycle, which took down 3 enterprise clients for 11 hours on a Tuesday morning. He approved a third-party data dependency that turned out to have a licensing conflict, which cost us $40,000 to unwind. And he pushed the team to accelerate the analytics refresh pipeline 6 months ahead of schedule, which introduced a caching vulnerability I had flagged twice in writing. I fixed all 3 problems, usually overnight, usually without Marcus ever understanding how close we had come to losing accounts. He thanked me at the all-hands twice. Both times he called me our head of infrastructure. My title was principal architect, but I stopped correcting him after the 4th time. The warning signs that he wanted me gone had been building for about 18 months before the Zoom call. A new VP of engineering joined, brought in from Marcus's previous company. A man named Greg Sutton who had the vocabulary of a senior engineer but had never shipped anything at scale. Greg and I disagreed on architecture constantly, and Greg had Marcus's ear in a way I never had. I started finding my technical recommendations overridden in planning documents. My calendar invitations to executive briefings stopped coming. My name began appearing lower and lower on project credits. The thing about being the person who actually keeps a system alive is that people around you slowly stop seeing the work because it never fails. Every problem I prevented was invisible. Every crisis I stopped before it started was just a normal Tuesday. What Marcus saw was a quiet, occasionally difficult senior employee who pushed back on his decisions and did not inspire anyone with motivational language in all-hands meetings. What he did not see was the one thing I had been quietly protecting for 4 years. I will tell you about that in a moment. The severance package arrived 2 days after the Zoom call, delivered by courier in a manila envelope. The termination letter was clean and corporate. The NDA was standard. But the non-compete was something else entirely. 18 months, no competitors, direct or indirect, no consulting for any company in the analytics space, no advising startups working on anything resembling what Viridian built. No freelance work that touched data pipeline architecture, business intelligence tooling, or enterprise reporting systems. They had essentially described the entire field I had spent 22 years working in and told me I could not operate inside it for a year and a half. I read the whole document twice, then set it on the table and looked out the window for a while. My wife, Carol, had been in treatment for an autoimmune condition for the past 14 months. The treatment was expensive and ongoing, and our insurance had come through Viridian. My daughter Megan was a junior at a university in Pennsylvania, and her tuition arrangement was tied in part to stock options I had earned over 8 years. Options that had been quietly during a board restructuring Marcus had engineered the previous spring. The non-compete was not just a professional inconvenience. It was a calculated attempt to make sure that even if I left, I could not survive leaving. I sat with that understanding for about an hour. Then I picked up the phone and called Howard Kessler. Howard ran a boutique IP and employment law practice out of an office above a dry cleaner in downtown Hartford. He had represented me once before, years earlier, in a contract dispute that had gone nowhere, and I had kept his number because I liked the way he thought. Slowly and precisely, with no interest in drama. I drove to his office the next morning with a folder of documents, a USB drive of time-stamped files, and one very specific question. Howard read through everything for about 20 minutes without speaking. Then he leaned back and tapped the non-compete with his pen twice. "They're terrified of you," he said. "I know. The question is whether it holds." He was quiet for a moment. "As written, under current statute, it probably does. 18 months would be aggressive but defensible if a judge is sympathetic to them." He paused again. "But there is something moving at the state level you should know about." He explained it carefully. A bill had been working through the state legislature for 2 sessions, one that would effectively ban non-compete agreements for software professionals earning under a certain threshold. The bill had passed committee with strong support and was expected to reach the governor's desk before the end of the calendar year, with a January 1st effective date if signed. I did the math in my head. That was roughly 9 months away. "Can I wait 9 months?" I asked. "If you're careful," Howard said, "you can do more than wait." I left his office with a plan, a clean understanding of what I could and could not do, and the external drive in my jacket pocket. The same drive Marcus had never thought to ask about. Here is the part Marcus missed entirely, and it was the only part that mattered. In February of 2017, 1 month before I signed my employment contract at Viridian, I built a small analytics module on my own laptop, on my own time, using no company resources, for a consulting project I was finishing before I came on board. It was a lightweight caching and event routing framework I called Cassian because I had been reading a biography of the Roman general that week and liked the sound of it. Cassian was not revolutionary. It was clean, efficient, and well documented, and it solved a specific problem in how data events were queued and prioritized for downstream reporting. I finished it, delivered it to my consulting client, and then noted the completion in my personal records with a timestamp and a signed hash. Just habit. When I joined Viridian and started working on their analytics pipeline, I noticed their event routing was broken in exactly the way Cassian had been designed to address. I mentioned to the CTO at the time, a man named Frank Ossi, who has since moved on, that I had a private framework that might fit. Frank said to use whatever worked. I integrated a modified version of Cassian into the pipeline. I raised the ownership question with Frank twice. Both times he said he would flag it for legal. Both times it disappeared into the noise of product deadlines. When Marcus arrived and Frank left, I raised it with the new CTO, who told me not to worry about legacy modules. I sent an email documenting the concern. It was acknowledged with a thumbs-up emoji. So Cassian sat in the heart of Viridian's platform for 4 years, not as a footnote, not as a utility, as a load-bearing structural component that 3 major product features ran through every single day. Marcus had fired the foundation without knowing what the foundation was. The 9 months that followed the Zoom call were the most disciplined period of my professional life. I vanished, not dramatically, not with an announcement. I simply stopped existing online. LinkedIn went dark. My GitHub profile went private. I removed my name from every professional forum I had contributed to. From the outside, I looked like a man who had been quietly broken by an unfair firing and retreated from the field. I was not retreating. 3 weeks after leaving Viridian, I registered a new LLC in Delaware through a registered agent, using a name that meant nothing. Arbor Junction Consulting. No website, no social presence, no fingerprints. On paper, Arbor Junction was a dormant holding company. In the small office space I rented behind a commercial bakery off Route 9, it was the beginning of something I had been thinking about for 2 years. I called 2 people. The first was Neil Kowalski, a back-end engineer I had worked with at a previous company who had since left Viridian on his own terms 18 months earlier. Neil was quiet, precise, and allergic to wasted effort. When I explained the situation, he said 4 words: "When do we start?" The second was Asha Renner, a former product lead who had been pushed out of Viridian 6 months before me, ostensibly for budget reasons, actually because she had presented a technical audit to the board that made Marcus look like he had been managing by wishful thinking. Asha understood both what we were building and why it needed to be built correctly. She became the third person in the room. The rules were simple and non-negotiable. No copied code, no leaked documents, no client poaching, no public commentary on Viridian, ever. We were building something new, and we were building it clean. Any resemblance to what we had done before would come from the experience in our heads, not the files on their servers. What we were building was a platform that did everything Viridian's platform promised and consistently failed to deliver. I want to tell you something about what it is like to build in secret. There is a kind of focus that comes from operating without an audience. No board presentations, no investor updates, no all-hands meetings where you perform confidence. You may not entirely feel. Just the work. Just the code. Just 3 people in a rented space that smelled like bread from the bakery next door, working through problems 1 layer at a time. We called the product Arbor, not because the name was brilliant, but because it was available and meant nothing to anyone who wasn't us. Arbor was not a copy, it was a correction, Every architectural decision we made was informed by watching Viridian's system crack and buckle under pressures Marcus had refused to plan for. We built failure tolerance into the core instead of bolting it on afterward. We built modular dependencies instead of a monolithic structure that required a team of senior engineers to navigate. We built the documentation from day one, because we had all spent years working on systems where documentation was an afterthought, and the person who understood why something worked was always one resignation letter away from taking that knowledge out the door. By late summer, we had a working prototype. By early fall, we had a demo that ran clean under simulated load that would have made Viridian's architecture weep. And while we were building, Viridian was quietly falling apart. I had no insider access to Viridian. I want to be clear about that. What I knew from public signals and from a handful of former colleagues who reached out to me over those months, always cautiously, always in ways that could not be traced back to them. What those signals told me was this. After I left, Marcus had assigned 2 of the junior engineers to maintain the systems I had managed, which was like replacing a structural beam with 2 sections of drywall and calling it load-bearing. The Cassian-based routing layer, which required someone who understood its internal logic to maintain correctly, began degrading within 90 days. Errors that had never existed started surfacing in enterprise reports. API timeouts appeared. Billing records began showing anomalies. The engineers knew something was wrong. What they did not know was exactly where the problem lived, because nobody had ever properly documented Cassian's integration points. I had flagged that documentation gap many times. Nobody had ever made it a priority. By October, 2 of Viridian's largest enterprise clients had reached out to their account managers expressing concern. One had begun market evaluation, which is a polite way of saying they were shopping for an alternative. The internal Slack messages I was not supposed to know about, shared with me by a former colleague who was appalled by how Marcus was handling the situation, described a support queue so backlogged that customer success managers had started giving clients their personal cell numbers to avoid the ticket system. Marcus responded to all of this by announcing a new funding round. The announcement was polished and aggressive. Series C, targeting $40 million. New partnerships in the healthcare analytics vertical. A product roadmap that described features that did not yet exist as if they were nearly complete. In the announcement, he used the phrase unprecedented platform stability 3 times. I read it on a Tuesday morning, sitting in the bakery office, drinking coffee from a paper cup. I printed the page, set it on the desk, and wrote one word in the margin: soon. The article appeared in early November. It was published on a technical blog under a pseudonym I will not repeat here, written in the dry, exacting language of an engineer who had spent a great deal of time thinking about distributed system failures. It did not name Viridian. It described a fictional company with a fictional architecture in enough structural detail that any senior engineer in the industry would recognize the fingerprints immediately. It dissected the caching vulnerability. It mapped the dependency chain. It asked, very politely, what would happen to the clients of a company running a mission-critical platform on infrastructure this fragile if the person who understood it was no longer available to maintain it? By the end of the week, 3 industry newsletters had linked to it. A senior CTO at one of Viridian's competitors had shared it on LinkedIn with a comment that said simply, "This is worth reading carefully." Marcus held an emergency all hands. I know this because 3 former colleagues messaged me within the hour. He told the team it was a hit piece by a disgruntled ex-employee, that the technical claims were exaggerated, and that legal was looking into it. He used the word disgruntled twice. The engineers in that meeting had already been quietly updating their resumes for 6 weeks. The article did not change what they were doing. It just removed the last sliver of doubt about whether they were doing the right thing. The phone call I had been waiting for came on a Tuesday evening in mid-December. My contact at the state legislature, a policy advisor I had met twice at a technology workforce panel, did not waste time with pleasantries. "The governor signed it this afternoon," she said. "January 1st, it takes effect. Non-competes for software professionals are done." I thanked her, hung up, and sat very still for a moment. 9 months, I had waited 9 months. I had not complained publicly, not violated the agreement, not given Marcus a single thread to pull. I had stayed clean, stayed quiet, and let him believe he had successfully neutralized the threat. Meanwhile, the law I had been waiting for had just been signed into effect. The non-compete that had been written to cage me for 18 months was now going to be legally unenforceable in 16 days. I called Howard that same evening. "I know," he said before I finished speaking. "I already started the paperwork." January 3rd. 2 days after the new year, 2 days after the non-compete expired under the new statute, the Arbor platform launched without a press release, without a launch event, without a single post on social media from anyone involved. It launched with a clean product page, a working demo environment, and a direct outreach to 11 prospective clients who had been waiting for a private preview invitation. 3 of those 11 were active Viridian accounts. I am not going to pretend this was accidental. The response was faster than I expected. Within 48 hours, 2 of the Viridian accounts had responded asking for a full demo call. By the end of the first week, one of them had signed a letter of intent. I did not poach them with aggressive pricing or promises I could not keep. I let the product speak. When your infrastructure does not fall down under normal operating conditions, the conversation with a client who has been living with outages and blank report exports tends to be fairly short. While Arbor was breathing for the first time, the cease and desist letter from Howard's office arrived on Marcus Calloway's desk. 5 pages, no theatrical language, just a precise legal argument delivered in the kind of calm that is more unsettling than anger. The letter documented the Cassian module, its provenance, and its timestamps. It attached the original file from February of 2017 with its signed cryptographic hash, predating my employment contract by 31 days. It mapped the module's integration into Viridian's platform using publicly available information and commit records my attorney had obtained through a prior legal discovery process. It included the 2 emails I had sent raising the ownership question, complete with delivery receipts, and noted that both had been acknowledged without resolution. The final paragraph was short. It stated that Viridian had been commercially operating a platform built in part on intellectual property it did not own, had done so for 4 years with awareness of the ownership question, and was now required to either cease using the module or negotiate a licensing arrangement. Marcus read the letter the same morning it arrived. I know this because his assistant called Howard within the hour, which is not what you do when a letter does not worry you. Later, the account I received secondhand was that Marcus had laughed when he first read it. He had waved it at his general counsel and said something like, "This is all he's got?" Then legal had pulled the commit history. Then they had found the GPG signature. Then they had cross-referenced the dependency map and found the Cassian routing layer sitting inside the analytics pipeline like a load-bearing wall in a house you are trying to claim you built alone. The laughter stopped. His general counsel said the words that ended the performance. We didn't rewrite his code. She did not say it loudly. She did not need to. In the silence that followed, Marcus understood for the first time the shape of what had been sitting underneath his company for 4 years. He tried to call me the same afternoon, 3 times from his work cell, once from a number I did not recognize. I had changed phones months earlier. My voicemail was disabled. There was no way in. Finally, a text arrived on a device I had already stopped checking. "Dan, can we talk? Please." The message failed to deliver. The hearing was scheduled for January 15th at 10 in the morning. Marcus's attorneys had tried to accelerate the timeline, hoping to use the non-compete to force an injunction against the launch. They were 2 weeks too late. By January 15th, the non-compete had been legally unenforceable for 15 days. What was left was the IP dispute, which was not the fight Marcus had wanted. Howard and I arrived before the building opened. The courtroom was small and cold, the kind of room where fluorescent light makes everyone look slightly tired. Marcus arrived with 3 attorneys and a junior associate carrying a box of documents. He did not look at me when he walked in. His lead attorney stood and delivered a confident opening argument about trade secrets, unfair competition, and a disgruntled employee attempting to leverage a technical claim that had been resolved years ago through implied licensing. The argument was well constructed. It would have been persuasive if the facts had been different. Howard stood and said very little. He submitted 4 exhibits. He cited the February 2017 file with its timestamp. He read 2 sentences from the emails I had sent during my employment, raising the ownership question and receiving no substantive response. He noted the new statute by number and referenced the date of its effect. Then he said, "Counsel, the non-compete died on January 1st. That is not contested. What remains is the question of intellectual property ownership. My client has a signed, time-stamped, cryptographically verified file predating his employment by 31 days. The company has 4 years of commercial usage and 2 unanswered emails. I believe the record is clear." The judge read the exhibits without speaking for about 4 minutes. Then he looked up at Marcus's attorney and asked one question. "Was this module authored before the employment agreement was executed?" A pause. "The timing is disputed, Your Honor." The judge looked at the timestamp on the file, then at the date on the employment contract. "It does not appear to be disputed by the documentation." Marcus leaned over and whispered something to his attorney. His attorney did not respond. The ruling came just before noon. Ownership of the Cassian module and its derivatives remained with me. The company's 4-year use of the module constituted commercially beneficial exploitation of intellectual property it did not own. A licensing arrangement was required, retroactive to the date of integration. There was one word in the ruling that hit Marcus harder than anything else: retroactive. 4 years. Every dashboard refresh, every client report, every enterprise analytics event that had passed through the Cassian routing layer was now passing through a system that legally required my authorization. They had built their product around a foundation they did not own, raised money against it, and promised clients stability that depended on it. The judge did not deliver this with any drama. He simply read the conclusion in a flat, even voice, the way a man announces a train departure. Then he moved to the next item on his calendar. I sat very still for a moment after the gavel came down. Howard closed his folder. Across the room, Marcus was speaking quietly with his attorneys. He had the look of a man trying to calculate how bad the numbers were. They were bad. The licensing negotiation took 11 days. I did not negotiate with Marcus directly. I did not want to. Howard handled the conversations with Viridian's general counsel while I reviewed numbers from our new Hartford office, which by that point had a real sign on the door and a second room for Neil and Asha. The final agreement was this: $8.5 million in backdated licensing fees, calculated from the date of integration, and $47,000 per month in ongoing usage fees tied to platform traffic volume. In exchange, they received a valid license to continue operating the module and a transition period to migrate if they chose to replace it. If they refused the agreement, we were prepared to file for injunctive relief, which would have meant they could not legally run the module while the injunction was active. Their platform could not survive that. The injunction was not a bluff. They signed on a Thursday afternoon. The document came through email. A junior legal associate handled the signature on their side. Marcus's name did not appear anywhere on the agreement. When the first payment cleared, I did not celebrate. I called Howard, told him to invoice for his fees, and sat for a while in the quiet office above the bakery. Then, I thought about Carol at her treatment appointment 2 towns over, and what it would mean to pay those bills without thinking about them the way I had been thinking about them for 9 months. I drove to pick her up. When she got in the car and asked how the day went, I said, "Good, really good." She looked at me for a moment. Then she smiled and said, "I'll make dinner. I want to tell you what the industry saw, because it matters." 3 technology publications covered the ruling within 2 days. Not as a revenge story, not as a human interest piece, but as a legal landmark about intellectual property rights for software engineers. About the gap between what companies claim to own and what they have actually contracted to own. About the risk of building enterprise infrastructure around individual contributors, and then attempting to erase those contributors without understanding what you are erasing. 2 of the articles did not mention my name. They did not need to. Engineers in the industry understood what had happened. Viridian's Series C fell apart within the week. 2 lead investors withdrew, citing unresolved legal and operational exposure. The third offered a sharply reduced term sheet that the board declined. Enterprise clients who had been on the fence about renewals made their decisions. The company issued a public statement that described the licensing agreement in language so carefully neutral it almost sounded like good news. Marcus held on as CEO for another 4 months before stepping back from product decisions. The board framed it as a leadership transition. Nobody who had been paying attention was surprised. I did not announce any of this. I did not post a thread. I did not do an interview. I let Arbor's growth speak, and it spoke clearly. By the end of that first quarter, we had 8 signed enterprise clients and a partnership with a regional healthcare network that gave us the runway to hire 5 more engineers. Neil sent me a message on a Friday afternoon. "I think we're real now." I wrote back, "We were always real. We just had to wait." There is one moment I return to when I think about those 9 months. It is not the hearing, and it is not the licensing agreement, and it is not the look on Marcus's face when his attorney told him they had not rewritten the code. It is a much quieter moment than any of those. It was a Sunday morning in late October, about 2 weeks before the article appeared. I had come into the office early because the bakery was closed on Sundays and the building was completely silent. I was reviewing the final architecture diagrams for Arbor's data pipeline, the section that had given me the most trouble, the section I had rebuilt 4 times before I was satisfied. I sat there in the silence looking at the clean lines of something that actually worked, and I understood for the first time since the Zoom call that I was not simply recovering from what Marcus had done to me. I had moved past it. The work had become the answer. Not the revenge, not the legal file, not the money. The work. Everything else, the ruling, the licensing fees, the collapsed funding round, was just what happened when you do the work correctly and let time do the rest. My father used to say that when someone shows you who they are, believe them the first time. Marcus showed me who he was the morning. He smiled into his webcam in front of 200 people and said the word passed. I believed him, and then I went to work. The lesson I carried out of that winter was simpler than any of the legal filings or technical arguments or carefully rotated VPNs. Patience is not passive. It is not waiting while someone else moves. It is building quietly while they celebrate too early. It is understanding the difference between the moment they think you are finished and the moment you actually are. I was never finished. They just forgot to check. If this story stayed with you, I would love to know what you think in the comments. Would you have walked away quietly and built something new the way Daniel did? Or would you have confronted them the moment you knew? There is no wrong answer. I find those conversations more interesting than the revenge itself. And if you believe that patience, preparation, and a well-documented timestamp can beat almost anything the powerful throw at you, subscribe to the channel. More stories about betrayal, survival, and the kind of justice that arrives slowly and lands hard are on the way.